Hi there, I'm Jason Ross. Welcome back to Modern Democracy and my series on using LLMs to do software development and kind of my exploration into what these tools are capable of. I think the last time I did a video in the actual coding side of things, I was using Google Gemini to do all of my software development. And there was for a couple of reasons. One, because it had the largest context window, and two, it seemed to give me the best results when compared against Claude and OpenAI as OpenAI's different codexes or models. So the thing that changed in February, early February, both OpenAI and Anthropic came out with new models. Now, in OpenAI, the codex model that they released, I think, is only accessible through the paid tier. And certainly the relevant Anthropic model that's kind of comparable is also on the paid side, but Anthropic also changed in the Anthropic side, Opus 4.6 was the version that came out, but shortly after that, they also released Sonnet 4.6. So Opus, again, is pretty much locked into the paid tier, so you have to pay, I think it's about $20 a month to be able to get access to that. Sonnet, on the other hand, is on the free side. And there's even been people saying that in some ways it may even be better than Opus for certain tasks anyway. But regardless of that, that's the model that I've been using for these exercises. So I've come to move. So now I've moved away from Gemini, at least until Google comes up with something equivalent. But certainly Claude, with the advent of Sonnet 4.6, it made a huge difference. The other thing that happened during, I'm not sure when exactly this happened, but it wasn't something that I played with until I started playing around with Sonnet 4.6, and that is the concept of projects. So I was familiar with a similar, I think they may also be called projects in OpenAI's ChatGPT. But with Claude, you get some additional functionality on the free side. And the big one is the ability to link to GitHub projects. There's actually a whole pile of stuff. If you click on the plus here, you can see that there's a bunch of connectors. So Figma, Canva, Gamma, there's all sorts of different in fact, that's just the featured ones. There's a ton. So Slack you can hook up. There's Atlassian if you do Jira and Confluence for task tracking and project management. There's a Hugging Face if you're accessing open source models that are out in the cloud. There's a whole pile of stuff here, but like I said, the one that I'm particularly interested in is the access to GitHub. So that's what I've got hooked up in my Pixel Engine project. Was an experiment with just seeing how Claude Code does with this new model. And to make the long story short, until now, I've always found that models can generate code pretty well, especially if it's stuff that's really popular in public. So this particular exercise, I focused on a pixel, so sort of like an old NES pixel-based graphics game engine, built from scratch using only pure basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So no third-party JavaScript libraries, no third-party CSS templating, all just pure plain modern HTML5, CSS3, JavaScript, whatever ECMAScript version it's at now. And I wanted to see, by just using prompts, how much functionality can I get Claude to generate? And the short answer was an awful lot. And it got almost everything that I wanted right between 95 to 100% of the time, which is a massive step in the functionality of these tools as far as software development is concerned. If you want to follow along, or if you want to check out this stuff later, let me open up my GitHub project here. So on github.com/rastamafug, which is my personal GitHub site, there's a public repository called arcade-engine, and that is where I've stored all of both the source code and the prompts. You can also find a README here, which gives you a full breakdown as to the list of functionality that's in this repository currently, as well as some documentation that tells you how to use the engine and how to configure it, and then some what's news on a couple of the most recent point releases, but don't worry about that too much. As well as I've got 2 templates. Now, one of them currently, I just remember, as I was testing this before I launched this, the platform is not working right now, and that's probably because I still have to do the conversion, but we're going to focus on this Pixel Canvas Zelda.html, which is essentially a top-down, like I said, sort of Nintendo-y, Legend of Zelda style game engine that allows you to have an overworld map and then maps for like caves and dungeons and even multi-level dungeons, and there's a whole pile of functionality that I built in step by step. And if you wanted to kind of follow along or even try this out yourself, there's a prompts folder here, which you'll find there's the initial prompt, and then there's all the different revisions, and there were only 11 additional steps that I did to get to the current state that I'm at right now. And as far as hand coding that I did myself, the only stuff, I got a fully functional, all the functionality that I built in, I didn't write the code for it. Claude did it out of the box. Now, again, some caveats. One, it's not really I wouldn't say it's the prettiest code or the most elegantly designed code. There's certainly lots of room for improvement. But I believe I can work with the model to do all of that. And part of that is because one of the big things that I started off with was I started with a single file HTML with the CSS and JavaScript embedded within the same HTML file. Which made it easy for testing because I could just open the file in a browser, and because it didn't have to access any sort of JavaScript libraries or whatnot, it was really easy to test. Now, once I got to the functionality ballooned to a point where it was almost a fully functional game engine, that's where I did a refactor, and I moved all the JavaScript code out to a separate folder tree of source. And that is what you see if we go back here to the README. That's what this Pixel Game Engine folder is. So if you go into source, you'll find the 2 template HTML files. And again, like I said, the platform right now, as of the time that I'm recording this, isn't working. I will try and polish that up and do some more polish on the overall code when I get some time over the next week or two. But the Zelda one is working as is. The only key difference is you have to host it using a web server, a local web server of some sort. And then the Pixel Game Engine folder is where we've got the full ES module. So it's a JavaScript library module. Index.js is where you can see, again, just sort of duplication of the file structure and saying what each of the different files do, and then all the exports that are coming from those that are exported publicly. Again, there is definitely room for improvement. It's not perfect. It's not even bug-free. There are, I know, some bugs whatsoever, but why don't I bring up the JavaScript, the actual game window? That's here. And I'll show you. So this is what I've built. Again, I did not write any of this, of the actual functionality. The only code that I wrote was some of the library imports, exports, and code changes I had to do to take one single JavaScript listing and extract the different module parts into subfolders and files. A lot of that I did by hand. Well, even that I got Claude to help me with, but once I got all the code with all the proper imports and everything linking and having reference to all the other parts of the library that used to all be in a single file and now are sort of spread across a big pile of source files, it worked. I didn't have to make any changes to the actual game engine. So this is my character. I can walk around. I can also interact with people. I can interact with somebody and I get a little pop-up. I'll see also on the top of the screen, I'm not going to show up on camera, but anyway, here, I'll use my mouse. I've got a health bar, I've got a gold counter, I've got an inventory with 4 slots. Like I said, I've got the ability to talk to people, so there's scripting dialogue paths that you can have in here. It tells you some commands about how to use things. There are actually weapons I can pick up, which change what I can do. Let me go down here. Oh, I can pick up gold. I can go here, open a chest, and now I've got a bow and arrow, which you can see in the upper hand corner. Again, not the best graphic, but the purpose of this was more about functionality rather on making it pretty. I've also got this mini map that I can toggle on and off. You can see in the bottom right hand corner. And there's template collision, so I've got walls that I can't interact with. There's definitely bugs. So you see I was over this chest, but for some reason that chest opened. So there are things that I can do to kind of fix this up. But I've also got portals. So if I go into this portal, there is a bug there in that I want the whole screen and the enemies to freeze while this goes on, but that's fine. So I've got this guy that comes over when I enter the cave first and says, take this heart, you'll need it. Again, just some scripting stuff. And then I can also pick up, I can shoot, or I can use a knife. I can use a sword. I can also toggle between my different inventory and shoot arrows. Now I do have issues where if there's another bug is if I pick up more than 4 items, they just sort of disappear. But like I said, this was all very it was all pretty easily just by using prompts. Okay, so now I've also got stairs here, so if I go down the stairs, I now have another... Oh, these guys are going to come after me. Oh. Anyway, let me go up here. If I go down levels, so now I have different types of enemies. There's a skeleton type guys here, and this is actually a spawner. Ooh. Let me just kill that guy. Like I say, I can pick up gold. There's also sprites for sort of have decorative patterns on the floor that you don't interact with. There's stairs up and down. So now you see there's a spawner underneath that chest that spawns new enemies every. It looks like about every 30 seconds or so. Now, if I go down here to this stair, and there's also some collision issues with the stairs, but again, there's also a boss. So now. Here I've got some initial, again, prompted dialogues that are coming from the Void Herald, and he's just warning me, and now there he is. So now he actually has different boss phases. So the first phase, he'll try and attack me with, if I get close, he'll attack me with a melee weapon. Then once I hit him, now he's going to start shooting magic at me. And once I kill him this time, again, there's bugs, I won't actually die. Now he has enemies that he spawns in addition to chasing after me, and once I kill him, so I can also kill his boss, his enemies, his minions, but once I kill him, I get a little animation, and I get the void reclaimed, you cannot stop, so obviously there's still lots of little bugs, but again, the void is vanquished, peace returns to the land, and now I can go and enter this portal, which will take me out of the dungeon and back to the main world. So, and yeah, there's also context clue. You know, depending on what happens inside the game, I'll get different dialogues from them. Oh, I think I just crashed. Interesting. First time that's happened, but in either case, it's also got, there's game music and sound effects. Let me just reload this. So all of this was built purely by using prompts with Claude. So let me go over this. Let me bring up my Claude window again here. And we'll kind of go through the conversation just to show you my workflow and how I got it to go. So I started with, I wanted to find a reference template that would be the base for developing HTML canvas-based single-file HTML pages that emulates pixel-perfect games. I want to simulate an 8x8 pixel grid of a defined screen size that can be scaled to fit any window size while maintaining a fixed ratio of X and Y pixels. Ideally, I'd like to define sprites within the source file and be able to reference and place those sprites within the grid at defined X and Y locations. If this is feasible, go ahead. Otherwise, suggest more viable alternatives. So that was all I needed to do for it to give me this. And so here, oh yeah, there wasn't much functionality in the first thing, but it did if I look at the source code here. So it created some sprites, which are using just basically I think it started, these are hex colors for each of the pixels. So it's essentially an 8, so you can see that there's 8 entries by 8 entries this way. It's all in a one linear array, but it's helpfully laid out to show you that it's an 8x8 grid. So you can see that there's nothing on the corners, which when you see here, so that's what these happy faces are. And then on the X, that's here, you can see, so you actually see there's the X shape there in a box. So it makes it a really easy kind of, I wanted this to be something that was really easy to mod and to customize, to be able to define individual sprites. Like I said, I'm sort of basing everything on an 8x8 pixel sprite aspect. So then I said, extend this template with a palette system, define a color palette array, and reference indices in sprite data instead of inline hex strings. So again, so it's starting with hex colors. I wanted to make a palette system so that we just refer to individual palette values in this grid. And then add a tile map layer system. So define a 2D array of sprite names or IDs and render the full map in one draw tile map call. Replace per pixel fill rectangle rendering with image data for bulk sprite blitting. Explain the performance trade-offs and add an input handler, keyboard, and gamepad that integrates cleanly with the game loop pattern. Now, all of that, again, comes from, you'll see here in the first response, so because, let me go back a step here. With Sonnet 4.6, I had extended thinking on, oops, just once, thank you. So, like I said, Sonnet 4.6 is sort of the more powerful engine. Extended thinking is essentially what's called chain of thought sort of built into the system, where it thinks through its processes, and that's what you see here, where it does, if I click on this in the interface, it shows you the sort of train of thought that it does before responding. So it says it wants an 8x8 grid, and it's got a bunch of key decisions. So very handy to kind of understand what its thinking is under the covers. And then once it was happy with its responses, this is what it gave me back. So it said it was feasible, and here's a working reference. And it gave you its design decisions based on that conversation, internal conversation it had, created the file, and read it, and then gave some responses. And so this part here, where you see these copy and pastable little prompt options, that's again coming from my, if I go to my settings, in my custom instructions, so in this personal preferences, conclude every reply with one or more suggested next prompts in code blocks. Provide multiple options if the topic can branch. So those two specific instructions in particular are what are giving me those sort of additional prompts. The rest of this, if you want to see, we want to learn more about these custom instructions that I've built up, you can go and look at my previous video on, I think it's my latest ChatGPT best practices, although the same instructions I've been using in all three of ChatGPT, Gemini, and Claude. Now, one thing I do notice with Claude is when I took the exact same text, which if you go to, I know I put it somewhere, I just can't remember where it is, so I'll put a link to the source for that if you want to check it out yourself. It's in one of my repositories, but again, it wasn't something I was thinking of before I started up this recording. But just as a small little aside, I did notice that when I pasted in, this is not the exact word for word text that I gave Claude. Claude, for some reason, when you set these personal preferences, it kind of rewrites it and simplifies it for you. So this is actually quite a bit shorter than what I actually gave it, but it does have the key part for me, which is that response end for this exercise. So that's where these are coming from. So actually, mostly what I did was have those instructions to provide next step prompts, including multiple if it can branch, and this initial paragraph. Almost everything else that resulted in that game engine that I just showed you was either suggested by Claude as far as prompts are concerned, or the code itself was implemented by Claude in response to the prompts that I gave it. And again, like I said, most of those prompts weren't ones that I personally wrote, except for the refactoring especially, and maybe a couple of other things. Or I made some modifications. But yeah, so that's where you're seeing these 4 prompts are these 4. I just basically copy and pasted all 4 of them and put them into one thing, and then it gave me the next set of code updates. Again, just to reiterate, if you go to the prompts folder here, you'll see here's that second prompt. So every time I went back to Claude to write more code, you'll find each one of those in a separate revision value file in this repository. Now, at some point, I'm probably going to roll all of this up into a single prompt document, and I'll just title each of the different sections as initial prompt revision 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth, just for better readability, I think. But I had the way that I did it anyway when I was setting this up was I had a separate file for each different revision. Okay, back to this. So then I got it rendered out a color palette, it created a tile map, changed the way that it rendered to make it a little more efficient, and added input handler so I could control things. So that was this version. So now I've got tiles, so you can see there's water, there's ground, there's some sprites over here, including some sprites like trees, or different tiles, I guess, that are trees. And then it gave me 4 new prompts, which so then I just took them and put them in. So I added a camera viewport system, which allows for a world larger than the screen. So right now, this particular one, we're limited to the size of the screen itself. So it's only, once I hit the edge of the screen, it ends. Added a sprite animation system. So even though there is a little bit of animation, which did I ask for that? I don't think I asked for it, but it did. It just threw it in. So then it gave me sprite animations. It had the collision layer for the tile map. So right now I don't collide with anything on the map. And then a simple entity component system to manage multiple moving objects without per entity hard-coded render and update logic. So that's kind of a standard practice for game development. You can look up entity component system. There's a Wikipedia entry on it if you're curious about what that means. But just some good game engine best practices. So then it went off and thought. So again, there's a whole bunch of stuff that it did. And then it gave me its response of what it added, which are those things that I asked for. And then it gave me a new version. So when I click on this, you can see now there's a character moving around on a path. There's animation. If I move around, you can see I've got a world that's much larger. I can collide, so I can't walk onto those tiles. But it's also, you can see that it's even given it so that it's not like my head's banging up against that. It's sort of, it gives it a more of a three-dimensional feel where I'm actually slightly overlapping, but I still collide with the tile from underneath, but on the sides I can't overlap with it at all. And then I also can't go into the water for the same sort of thing. And then, like I said, there's a couple of folks there. I don't think I can interact with them yet. No, not yet. Okay, so that then went to this, where I added scene room system so I could have multiple name maps and have transitions where I can walk onto a portal tile or off a map edge to go to another map, that sort of thing. I added a UI layer, so I could have like a heart. That's where you could have heart and inventory and that sort of stuff. And then spatial hash or chunked entity grid to make world.query and collision checks that scale to hundreds of entities without iterating over all of them. So this is more of an efficiency thing. And again, I think all of this stuff is pretty much exactly, and then added a save load system, so I can also save my game, and then when I reload the page, it'll reload from the save, which is kind of handy. And then, this is one more that I added in. I said, add a sound engine that allows the user to define music tracks and sound effects, so background music and on-event triggering, and use codified notations. So there, it gave me all of that. And so one thing I should make note of here, at this point, I'm still suggesting multiple features to add, primarily because I'm still pretty early in the development phase, so the source code itself is not very long. You can see it's only a few pages of HTML code. So at this point, I was okay with kind of throwing everything in and seeing what it gave me back. And anyway, so this is what we got for this step. So now, I think it's F9 to load, and then F8. I can hear music playing. There's also characters, I think. Yeah, so now I can talk to characters and interact with them. So F5 saves the game. So now if I hit F9, it reloads where I saved. And it should also be a portal. So there's a portal here that if I go on to, and there's some collision bugs, but again, nothing too bad. Now I've got a guy here that I can talk to on a completely different map. This one is limited to the size of the screen. If I go back in the portal, however, there's a trigger, I'm back on the outer world. So that was a sort of a save spot for me where I said provide a brief summary of the project, including a current feature list that can be used to introduce the source code to new model conversations. So here's where, at this point, I was figuring I was getting pretty full. In fact, I may have, at some point around this point in the conversation, it may have said, Claude, something you'll know when you start to run out of, again, to reiterate about how large language models work, they have a limited context size. So there's only so much text you can have in a conversation before essentially the model starts to lose the thread and make mistakes and essentially get dumber. So this was the point where I was saying, okay, I want to sort of start with a fresh conversation, but give me sort of something that I can sort of put into, I think I put this right into the README at the time. And then it gave me some more. I don't think I did anything with those. Okay, so let me go back to the repository at this point, which is here. So again, I had a README. I started putting my source code. I think I had, because at this point it was just this Pixel Canvas Zelda file. So I stored it in my source folder, and then I went into, this is about the time that I went and set up a project. I think this first conversation was outside of a project. So at this point, I then went to, if you go into the Claude interface, there's a projects button here. If you click it, it allows you to create new projects. And I've created a couple. I'm going to cover this in a separate video. But here's my Pixel Engine project. And as part of this, I did add, so here you can upload, so I added a GitHub. I've also got Google Drive hooked up to this. And this, any sort of connectors that you've added as part of this add connectors functionality should show up here. So you can add other things into your project. This is not limited to just GitHub. You could have it even look into your Google Drive or your email and that sort of thing. You can do, like, it's incredibly versatile. This is kind of in the context of what the industry is calling agents, I think, in this sort of concept where an agent can, although this isn't quite an independent agent, but it's where you're adding more context to a conversation. The other thing you can have is instructions, and I don't have any custom instructions for this particular project, but again, when I go and cover in another video my other project on Basic 09 development, I do actually have custom instructions as well. But let me click on this for a second here. So you can see once you've added your GitHub project, you can then select what source files from that project do you want this which sources from your GitHub repository do you want your Claude project to be aware of? So you don't have to let it have access to everything. And in fact, here I've given it access to the README, so it understands sort of the overall, that's what I'm using as sort of this is what the project is and how it works. And then the source, I've added everything in the source folder. So I've got my 2 templates at this point and the Pixel game engine. Like I said, at the time I initially set it up, it would have only been this one HTML file because the JavaScript and the CSS was inside of it. But as you add more source code to your repository, you can link it in here. Now, one thing I will note, if you are using this particular functionality, every time you push changes up to your GitHub, you have to go into your project on the GitHub and you have to click Sync Now. If you don't click Sync Now, it won't know about those changes. It's not going to automatically do it. You have to manually tell it, I've updated my GitHub repo. Go and so it knows to go and look for whatever's there. It probably caches the stuff that you've given it access to within the Claude environment. So again, I don't know exactly why you have to manually do it, but you do, and that's my guess of why, is that it's probably using that sync to pull whatever files you've told to give it access to and store it in the cloud inside the Claude system. So once I got that done, I think this might have been the next one. Let me just double check on my actual repository. So the next thing that I did was I didn't change the JavaScript code, but I did pull it out into a separate JS file that I linked to this template. And then I said I wanted to create a second example that demonstrates a single screen profile game such as Donkey Kong or Pac-Man using the same JavaScript library. So again, I wanted this pixel engine to not just be for like top-down adventures. I wanted to use the same engine to be able to define a tiled screen where you're sort of a platformer kind of concept. So here you can see I've got my GitHub is now attached to this conversation, and I said I wanted to do that refactor. So there's where it did. So now it refactored the Zelda, and then it created a new platformer. So here you can see it updated my Zelda. Now I don't think this is going to work because I've changed these files. Yeah, it's not going to find that source code, but you can see here instead of so it's got all of this JavaScript, but it's referring to it. So now it's got this pixel canvas engine.js that's being imported into the HTML, and now it's only got so sprites are specific for this game, and more sprites here for different things. So yeah, so now we've got sprites for like grass, stone, wall, cave floor, water. So there's the 2 water animations, trees, flowers, crystals, portals, NPC A and B, so the 2 different types of NPC. My player animations, so those are defined here, D1, D0, so that's a walk animation, and then idle, down animation, up animation, and then sideways, left or right, and it probably just reverses it depending on which direction you're facing. You can also see that it's registering the tile animations, registering tracks. So this is my notation system where it's choosing, I'm assuming these are keys and duration. So the 5th octave E, 5th octave G, 5th octave A, and half note, whole note. I'm guessing is what the notation is. I actually haven't dug into the implementation of it. And then triangle, sign, triangle. Those are your cave. So that's overworld. There's 2 instruments playing, a square and a triangle, and then sign and triangle. I guess these are waveforms. And then it registers sound effects for confirm, dialogue, portal. Every time you do one of those, it plays a different sound effect. Either a square wave, sine wave, or triangle wave is what it looks like. And then clips, so this is how it does the animation. Build overworld, this is where it's building the map, including kind of putting in water and stone, walls, trees, flowers, portals. Building the cave map, and here we've got our dialogue, the patrol, so the direction that the individual characters move. You can see these are each individual dialogues. New line is supposed to have multiple lines, and then player entity gets created, and then this is the game loop. So here's every engine tick, we do a whole bunch of different calls to the library to kind of make the game work. So again, I am familiar with sort of JavaScript-based game engines. I've played around with what's the one that I've used before most recently? There's a couple of open source ones that I've played around with, but every game engine sort of has basic mechanics and sort of game theory, the theory of operation, how these sort of things are built. That was sort of the assumptions that I got to take advantage of, because I assume these models are kind of overall general purpose knowledge tools, and they would have been trained on a lot of game design, game logic, terminology, that sort of stuff. So I was able to kind of take advantage of that, especially with the follow-up prompts, to just let it kind of lead me along of adding extra features until I got to something that feels like a pretty solid, at least starter game engine. Like I said, there's still bugs and tweaks and polish that I can add to it, but you could build this current system into a pretty functional, full-formed game with only having to make a few minor changes and stuff. Okay, so that's the division of source code. How we've got the JS engine here is where we've got a single library file, and it is quite large, and it's basically all these different functions. It was sort of keeping track of things that got added in on different requests. It broke it down into different sections. So you had your config, your palette is defined here, font. So this is the actual printable pixel-based font that's defined on the screen. It does it all in it's just using zeros and ones for sort of. So these are actually still it looks like it's a 5x7 font character set. So each one of those entries in that array represents one horizontal row. You can sort of look at them stacked on top of each other. So you can see like a space would be nothing. An A, you can see there's the top of the A, there's the sort of sidebars, and then the crossbar on the A, and then more sort of going down the sides. So that's how this all works. And then there's, like I said, everything here is the sort of the generic library that each of the different implementations go. And then the canvas platformer. So this one, let me just go to source, is now a Donkey Kong-ish kind of engine. I can't, without doing some jiggering around, I can't really demonstrate it, but like I said, it did work at the point that I was kind of testing and getting it to add functionality or design to that level. Where it did essentially do a sort of a Donkey Kong-ish. You had like a bunch of platforms with ladders between them, and then there were some enemies on the different platforms, and then barrels getting thrown down, and you had to get to the top to sort of win the level, and then it would reset. So both of those templates use the same engine in the JavaScript file. Okay, so then I went back to the Zelda game. So we added a HUD layer with status bar, hearts for coins, item slots, all rendered in the frame buffer. So again, so at this point I won't kind of be able to show you the in-between steps, but that's where we got this put up. Added a particle system, so that's where we've got, so that's these little animations coming out of the portal. That's part of the particle system. Quest flag system, so that's where we have the different things you can trigger different events in the game. And then simple scripting, so you can define a scene, event sequences. So that's where cutscenes. So that was the one where the guy came, when I entered the cave the first time, the guy walks over and then presents some dialogue. That's one of those scripting sections. The quest flag is more where if you start the game talking to a player, one of the NPCs, it'll say, hey, there's something in this chest, if you go pick it up, and then come back to them, they'll respond with a different text reply. So that's kind of that quest flag system. Then after that, we added a chest entity type. So this is where I had chests and I could define objects inside. So configurable loot, it plays little animations, interactable by pressing the Z key. And then damage system, where I had enemies have a hitbox, and if they touch you, you take damage. And then you have a little brief invincibility frame, so you don't just take damage kind of thing. And that's where I added the minimap. Now here, I may have moved this into a separate conversation, or this may have been where I started, because you see this Claude response could not be fully generated. I think this might have been around the time that I started limiting the amount of functionality. I started going one or two things at a time on each prompt, because this started to really bog down the responses to the point where I wasn't able to generate them anymore. So, but by this point, I already had a game map with multiple screens and NPCs and inventory system, to a very rudimentary inventory system, and a whole bunch of stuff, music and sound effects and that sort of stuff. So, it was pretty impressive just getting to this point on and being able to just prompt it whatever I wanted, including whatever suggestions it gave me. I think at this point I did switch to a new conversation. So then let me go back here. I'm a little fuzzy on specifically when I did start limiting the amount of things that I asked it to do, but that was obviously a point where I couldn't continue with that specific conversation. Once it started saying it couldn't completely generate it, that's where you have to start tweak your approach. And like I said, there's two sort of options there. One is reduce the amount of actions that you're asking it to take, and two is just start a new conversation and pick up where you left off. One or both of those should solve your problem for you. Okay, so then, so this is where I probably hadn't refreshed my GitHub project, so I was, I think this is where I was kind of learning this. I was learning how to use Claude's projects and how linked GitHub projects work as I was doing this. So this was definitely one of those things where I kind of had to discover that, I do have to both push up and commit the changes to my GitHub project, as well as hit that refresh button in the project settings itself. Again, that's this refresh here, in order for it to work. I got it to do an updated README as well. I think this was also something I noticed, that it was because I had linked my README in my GitHub project, but if I wasn't updating the README as I was adding functionality, and so some of the thing, and especially at this point where I switched from having the JavaScript code embedded inside the HTML to separating it out to a separate file, that's where I started to get some incorrect implementations and stuff. So that's, I think, why I started to say, okay, update my README, and then I took that, updated it in my repo, and then hit refresh. And I don't think I did anything else beyond that. So it did give me the downloadable README, which again, you can sort of take a look here. So this just gave me repository structure. So again, here we've got that engine, and then there's templates, although I don't think that was correct. I think they were in the same folder, but yeah, even the names, you see the names aren't quite right here. So this is where I was kind of still discovering about the project and how you work with GitHub within this context. But it did give me an engine API, told you the different functionality, camera collision, ECS, animation scene, sound, save, load, input, that sort of stuff. Oh, this was the other thing that I found was interesting, was so on the platformer, it had ladders rendered, but they didn't go all the way from the bottom platform to the platform above, which meant I could climb the ladder, but it would just stop at the top of the ladder, and I could never get to the next platform by climbing. Now, because I hadn't been specific about jump physics, I could jump to the platform, so I could still sort of test most of the platformer template as is, but I did notice that the ladders weren't working. The other thing I said was, when the player dies before they respawn, if they are still in contact with an enemy, they will lose a second life. So there was sort of a delay between when you got hit and when the screen reset, when you reloaded for your next life. And that window was longer than the invincibility window you have when you get, because again, an earlier request I asked was for invincibility frames. So invincibility frames is just a concept that when your character gets hit, you start flashing for a period, and as long as you're flashing, you can't take more damage. So that would time out before the timeout would occur for resetting the level, which meant I would end up losing 2 lives. This first bug, though, in particular, was one that I wasn't sure I was going to get a good response from, and this is because of my experience to date with these models is that they're really not good at spatial directions. If you can describe in detail sort of logic, it'll follow along and you both understand what you're talking about as well as give you proper results. But if you say, like, And the reason why I was focusing on pixel-based engines in particular was because for the large language models that have image either recognition or image generation, there's a lot of limitations in how you can sort of direct them to do things. Even with the current stuff, like I was playing around with Google's Nano Banana 2, which came out, I think it was last week. And it does, so things that the image generation, image viewing, or sort of, what would be the right term? The ability to sort of look at an image and understand the contents with that, the sort of what's inside of it. Things that models have traditionally stumbled over is they can sort of, you say, I want to have a picture with a dog howling at the moon, sitting next to a dog house. Even if you said, I want it sitting to the left of a dog house, it might put it on the right. Or if one thing you couldn't say is, I want the dog to be X number of pixels away from this doghouse, and especially like, the images that they would render would be something that's more like a 1024 by 768 minimum size image. So you're dealing with much larger resolution than you are dealing with something that's very pixel based. So part of the reason for me wanting to try a pixel engine was because I knew that it wouldn't really understand pixels, or at least that I wanted to sort of see how well this particular model dealt with that type of imagery. Where you're dealing with very limited graphic resolution and very specific placement when you're trying to lay out like a platform level or that sort of thing. So, like I said, I just said that the ladders don't extend all the way up to the upper platform. And it said each ladder stops one row short of where the player physically stands on when on the destination platform. The player snaps to plat row -1 times tile size, so the ladder must reach that row. Currently, none of the ladders, including the row the player occupies when standing, include the row the player occupies when standing on the upper platform. So that was why it didn't happen. The double def it figured out and fixed right away. But for the other one, so the fix for the one extending ladders, it added this, instead of going from 14 to 15, it went. I think it's because it's going, the lower numbers are higher up on the screen. So it only did, if the platform was at our row 13, it was doing 14 and 15. And so what it did here, it put another ladder above the platform, at row 12. It still put the platform at row 13 and then did 14, 15, which it kind of extended the ladder, but effectively it made the ladder go beyond the platform, even though there was still a gap. That gap now was able to be passable because there was another ladder directly above it, essentially another little short ladder. So it kind of worked, but it still wasn't rendering the ladder on where the platform was, because it was essentially rendering a separate tile, which is the platform tile. So that's where I said the on-hit bug is fixed. Technically, the ladders that connect each platform are now able to be climbed, but the top section of the ladder is appearing above the platform, which looks like a second broken ladder. There is still the same visible gap at the top of the ladder under each platform. So then it came through and it gave me another update. So it filled the visual gap using the background layer. And then it extended the ladder set virtually. So I think essentially what it did was that it did end up putting in the other ladder piece below where the platform was, but it still was extending the platform. It was an invisible ladder above the platform, which is sort of how it kind of worked. I don't think I've got a proper resolution for this still, but I did say, no, this is a separate bug. Oh yeah, so this was more about the wind condition where it wasn't triggering at the right place. I wanted it to trigger as soon as you got to the top of the platform, that the Donkey Kong on one side and, well, Donkey Kong and Pauline, which is the person you're supposed to rescue, I wanted the wind condition to trigger when you climbed all the way up to that platform, and instead it was actually triggering down below it. If you climbed the ladder that was below it, it would trigger about halfway up the ladder. If you jumped, it would actually trigger when your head sort of crossed the threshold of the platform, and not when you got all the way up and landed on the platform. So that's what I was talking about here, and that's why I said it was either a bug or possibly two. So then it did some additions to that, and then and this is where it actually did two different wind checks. One whether you're in the air and when you're climbing the platform, and it's the same logic that both were kind of calling. So this is the suggestion that it gave. Now I also don't know why. This is where one of these Claude does strange things on where sometimes when it gives those suggested next prompts. Does it do it at all in this conversation? It might be on a conversation by conversation basis, but you can see here on the previous ones, this code, there would be a separate code block for each one of these prompts that you just copy. But for some reason in this conversation, again, like my instructions haven't changed, but for whatever reason, because these next prompts were in part of something that was a code block, yeah, for some reason something's got screws up on the rendering of this, and it's not predictable. It is definitely a bug of some sort, but I still get the prompt. So anyway, I did notice. So this is it. So I wanted to. So I just asked it to refactor it into a name function. Check when to keep it dry. Dry is don't repeat yourself. In addition, this check still seems wrong. Now both conditions are triggering true when the player's feet are above the top platform. Are below the top platform. So for jumping, the player's sprite is half above the platform and half below. On the ladder, the player's only halfway up the ladder. So that's where it went and fixed that. And then even though there's no visible ladder above the platform, this is where I was talking about before. So once I got the win condition fixed, I went back and noticed that this was this other ladder bug where now there was the fully visible ladder rendered on the screen between two platforms, but there was still an invisible one that you could climb above the next platform that only went up about a third to halfway up between the next platform and that one. So that was this description here where you can still sort of climb it, or if you're jumping and you're in the air, you actually sort of end up climbing the ladder. So that's where it went and updated that. Okay, so that's the platform example. I don't know if I got any further. I may have done one more thing or two with the platform, but most of the rest of the focus of this was on the Zelda engine. So this is where I went. Let me get up here. So I said, review the Pixel Canvas Engine JS library for dry optimizations and increased code clarity. So now at this point I had an engine that was robust enough that I wanted to kind of do a little bit of a code review, and then it decided there's a bunch of things that it could do, and I said to refactor with all the fixes. I took this one. I didn't use that suggestion, and I didn't use that suggestion. This might be where I started getting down to one or two things. So I asked for a sys enemy pattern. Again, this is just a suggestion to have a state machine. So is the enemy idle? Is it patrolling? Is it chasing? Is it attacking? I added a ranged enemy variant with a projectile weapon. So that was where the boss is using that functionality. I think I had some enemies at one point doing that, but I think all the enemies now are, other than the boss, are all melee attacks. But there is functionality within the engine allows you to define a ranged enemy that can shoot things like magic fireballs or that sort of thing. Then I said implement a spawner. So that was on the level just before where the boss is. There's that spawner I demonstrated where the one skeleton appears every 30 seconds or so. And then added an aggro table so that if one enemy spots you, other enemies in the same group will also aggro towards you. I know there's at least one of the cave levels that has that defined, but I haven't really tested that. So there may be bugs on it, but it does have the functionality at least to be able to sort of group enemies so that if one enemy sees you, it alerts everybody else and they all start coming. Then we did a line of sight check so that if the enemy can't spot you if there's a wall between you and the enemy. Again, I haven't done a full test on it. I'd need to do some more complex level design to really fully kick the tires on this, but that's functionality that was added in. And then implement a lost sight timer. So that's where if they haven't had line of sight within a certain number of seconds, they'll just go back to what they were doing, which is patrolling or whatever, and lose the aggro state. Then I took all of the instructions that I had added since the last time I did a README update, and I told it to go and update the README again with all of that functionality. So it did that. And then add a README section for the sound engine, so like how to register sound effects, background music, play sound effects, master gain, and note sequencing format. So just how you design music or sound effects. Then we added the boss entity pattern to the README. Again, this is a prompt I think it gave me, probably up here. Yeah, this one here. So yeah, I'm definitely doing one prompt at a time at this point, just because again, things are getting the library is getting so big that I wanted to kind of get more incremental in the changes that I did, both for testing purposes and also just because otherwise I find that it could end up failing. So the boss entity pattern didn't even require new code in the library. I was just taking sort of I think I was taking everything else that was pre-existing and building this boss entity pattern where you had like a multi-phase boss and dialogue and that sort of stuff. And then more documentation, including what happens when two groups share the same name or propagate radius overlaps a different group. Okay, so again, most of these things that I'm providing here are prompts that it's giving me automatic, and I'm just taking and passing them back in. So this is mostly a documentation process, I think. Yeah, documenting the load save. Okay, so that's all README documentation updates. All right, so then I went back. Now that I had my README and I updated my repo again, I then went back to here and said update the template project to make a second cave level enemies part of the same aggregate group. Add a skeleton spawner on the third cave level and remove all existing enemies. Keep spawning enemies from the spawner every, it says every 10 seconds. I think it's more like 30. And then add a fourth cave level, including stairs connecting to the third level, and add a boss. Play an animation when the player first reaches the level with the boss threatening the player. The boss should be a three-phase boss. First, they chase the player and attack with melee until defeated. Then visually change. It doesn't do the visually change, but it did attack with ranged magic until defeated. And then spawn other enemies that attack the player until the boss is defeated. Then play a victory animation. Okay, so then it gave me that. And then I updated the README. So this was where I think I went. So this is the point where I decided I wanted to refactor this game engine single file JavaScript where it just had every function listed and global parameters, attributes, and everything was kind of, so it just got imported. I wanted to make it something a little more robust, and I wanted to, because this file at this point was thousands of lines long, I wanted to break it down into an ECMAScript module, a JavaScript module, which is more, again, that's, right, so that's this game engine where we've got some sort of top level where we've got assets, config, physics, renderer, and world, and then we've got the user interface folder where we've got the heads-up display and the minimap logic, and then systems for things like animation, chess, combat, cutscenes, dialogue, the ECS, enemy logic, flags, game loop, input particles, save load. It's not a perfect breakdown. There's probably some more things I might break out, and I might also reorganize the way this is structured, but the big goal was to take that large, thousands of lines long listing and break it down by individual pieces of functionality, put them into separate JavaScript files that can have their own sort of internal private variables, and get something a little more structured and more professional. We're only probably half to 3/4 of the way to where I'd like it to be, but it's a lot more manageable and a lot easier to read, and you kind of understand things. I think there's, especially in the parts that are exposed out to the templates that are using it, I'd probably refactor more, but this was more just about kind of making this a little less unwieldy and but without losing any of the functionality, because like I said, as you can see here, there's a huge list of functionality that we've now added into this project. So I initially started it because I think I started doing this after I ran out of Claude use, because I'm on the free plan. You can only do so much, and with Claude it usually resets once you run out of prompts. You get recharged within 2 to 6 hours, it seems like. Whereas I know Gemini, and I think both Gemini and ChatGPT, once you run out, I think you get more sort of queries or more tokens generated by the model, but once you run out, you are pretty much done for like a 12 to 24 hour period. Whereas with Claude, I think you can run out of your limit, but you can get more uses more frequently. So anyway, I was in a period where I wasn't able to use Claude anymore, so I tried this at Refactor first with Gemini just to see how it did, and it gave me something that was a start, but it wasn't functional. But I did check it into my repository, and I said, okay, the README is how the old library worked. Please update the README to reference the current ES module design. And I can't remember. Oh no, I may have. So this at some point, either before that prompt or shortly after, was when I had to do some of my hand coding, because whatever code I did get generated by Gemini, and maybe with a little assistance from Claude, wasn't working out of the box, and a lot of it was because a lot of these JavaScript files weren't importing all the things that they needed from other files within the same module, or the actual templates themselves weren't pulling out everything they needed to from the module library, or the library itself wasn't exporting all the stuff that these template files needed. So it was the combination of those three things that I ended up that was really the bulk of my actual coding effort, which is mostly just copying and pasting and importing and moving things around where they should be. So I got the current structure that I have. I probably added some more of the files and broke some of the larger sections into a few other files, and then getting that working. So once that was done, I then got this conversation. So I was having problems after defeating through the stage of the boss. The success dialog messages appear, but then an error appears. So I was getting some errors in the code, and this was where, it was imports mostly. Now I don't think it actually gave me the right answer for some of this, but I was able to figure out that it was due to an import error, and so this is part of that process. I don't think I need to go over it because I don't think I could give you a clear A to B to C step process of it anyway. And I think that's it. So that's all that I wanted to kind of go over. But like I said, this was an enormous amount of progress for very little, certainly hardly any coding effort on my part, other than, like I said, the biggest effort I personally had to do was that refactor from that single file JavaScript library and push it into a folder structured set of sub JavaScript files and link everything and put all the proper imports and stuff. That was the only real coding effort I had to do. Everything else, including the prompts that were needed to add the functionality to the game engine, were almost all generated by Claude. I just wanted to kind of demonstrate how advanced these tools have gotten in the last month. This is a massive change. Like, I've certainly, I don't know if I said this publicly, but in my own sort of internal strategizing and philosophizing about where this technology could go, I've been knowing for the last couple of years that I certainly don't need to write code from scratch myself ever anymore. But we're now at the point where I don't need to write code for a lot of what I wanted to do. And like I said, this is plain HTML, CSS, JavaScript, but still all of the functionality, I didn't need to get to the level of detail, like all of those instructions for adding new features, because the problems I was asking it to solve were pretty common, well-known problems, because game development has been around for decades at this, well over 50 years at this point. So the theories behind it, especially this type of pixel-based engine stuff, which is, 40, 50 years old, and it is over 50 years old, really. Even the first video game system, like the Magnavox Odyssey, maybe not the Odyssey, but certainly once you get to the Atari 2600, you had sprites and I don't know if tile maps were quite there, but certainly at when you're dealing with at the NES level in the 1980s, all of this side of concept was already kind of baked into game development. So if you're trying to solve a custom solution that is based on sort of well-known, well-trodden either software development processes, either general or subject specific, like game development, these models can do almost all of the work, and it's a lot easier to sort of direct it, including, like I said, if you've got this custom instructions like I have, where I ask it to prompt the next steps. I don't even have to think about how to word the next steps to get the additional functionality that I wanted. Anyway, I've got more thoughts kind of on the future of my career path and software development in general, but that's for another video, I think. But I hope you enjoyed this. I know it was a bit rambly, but I kind of wanted to show just how impressed I was with using known technology, and how you can generate software at a remarkably quick rate with hardly little effort, and get things that are at least functional, if not production ready. And I guess just to kind of wrap things up, the poor state of the code base right now, and the fact that I had to do that refactor, I could have set up better parameters when I started this process to start with an ECMAScript folder structure, and to focus on, like, I know one of the biggest improvements I want to do is to really revisit the interface between the game engine library and HTML pages that want to implement it. Like, the definitions for the sprites and the music and the tile maps and all that sort of stuff should be in the individual game HTML and maybe some supporting JavaScript files. And they just need to, and we need to have entry points for the game engine that you can pass in. Okay, here's my sprites, here's my sound, here's my music, here's my tile map, and then and use and call game engine calls for things, different game events and that sort of stuff. So there's still a lot of work in polishing this into something that I would consider really production ready. But that effort, if you know exactly what you want, like if you're somebody who's got that professional knowledge already, you can start this project with those details, and you can provide code examples and templates of how you want things to be laid out, how you want your code to look. Maybe you've got, like, I don't need, like, one of the things I think it isn't consistent with is how it names variables that are private to a JavaScript file inside of the library versus something that's exported and available to either other parts of the library, or even exported all the way out to public access for people using the game engine. That sort of stuff, and naming conventions for procedures and with the different functions and that sort of stuff. Like I said, that's all things that, one, I don't think will be all that difficult to fix, because I can, once I describe the specific issues, I think Claude will be able to do that work accurately without rewriting the stuff I don't want rewritten, and sort of targeted to the changes that I want. But like I said, as I get better at knowing how to direct these tools, the quality of what I get out the first time is going to rise as well. So as a learning experience, this was extremely valuable for both improving my skills to talk with these models, but two, to better understand the power that's available now, and just the massive step up in capabilities and accuracy that these models have achieved within the space of a month, the last month. Like, the stuff that was available before February was not nearly as capable as the stuff that I've been playing with these past couple of weeks. So anyway, I hope you found this all enjoyable and interesting. I will be following up this video with another Nitro OS 9 Basic 09 development. So this was one I had on my retro channel. I'll probably upload this to both my Modern Democracy and my retro channel when I create the video for it. But this was more using Claude to write code for technology, and in this particular case for an obsolete computer and an obsolete programming language for which there's very little detail out in the internet, and is actually, because it's a flavor of BASIC that is obscure, and there's these models are trained on far more accurate basics. I was curious, now that I got to test it with a sort of well-known and commonly used and sort of the cutting edge current technology, which and got such success with, I was curious to see how it would do something a lot more obscure and where the models before were making far more mistakes. And spoiler, it did a remarkable job. I will come back with another video when I record that one. But anyway, for today, that's all. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.